We're going to have a marathon today, so I hope you're looking forward to a medal. We're going to give medals out. Gene, you get to wear the prettiest things.
It's all about the costumes.
Aisha, good to see you. And Brad, hello. Are you up there, my friend?
Hello. Great to join you by phone, and I wish I could be there.
Well, it's great to have you here. You know, I thought, I'm such a fan of, well, all of you, but particularly data. And Brad Sears and the Williams Institute 15 years ago began looking at, one, the density of LGBTers in the United States by zip code and looking. And, the whole notion of mapping has become very important. And as we think about the question of unfinished business, what needs to go, I'd like to frame it in terms of maps and how we're thinking about it. And Brad, I just thought, maybe you could give us a quick frame of how you see, to kind of, I know you're often, well, we're going to test your visualization capabilities by helping us to understand what the big challenges are that you at the Williams Institute are focused on right now. And then I'll bring in Gene and Aisha.
Thank you, and that's great. And I think thinking about a map and how LGBT rights have proceeded in terms of geography in regions of the United States is a great lens. So if you think about formal equality, where the laws have changed on the books for LGBT people, there's definitely a geography to that, and it's not a surprising one. You would see the states that have been shaded in with equal laws beyond marriage are really still on the coast, in the West, in New England, and on the East Coast, and then somewhat in the upper Midwest. But the parts of the country and then the LGBT people who've been left behind, other than having marriage equality, live in the South, Midwest, and Mountain States. So of the 9 million LGBT Americans, about 60% of those LGBT Americans live in the South, Midwest, and Mountain States, similar to the rest of the population. But they differ from LGBT people on the coast in important ways. First of all, they're much more racially and ethnically diverse, more likely to be black, particularly in the South, and Latino in states like Texas and Florida. But when we look at how they're doing socioeconomically, there's also some surprises. If we looked at average income or rates of having a college degree for LGBT people nationally, we'd see slightly higher than average rates. But when we break it up regionally, we see that flattens out in the South and actually reverses somewhat in the Midwest. So while it's true that people in general are less likely to have college degrees or more likely not to have low income or more likely to have low incomes in the Midwest, that becomes even more true for LGBT people. So the lack of legal protections, the more challenging social climate is still really impacting people's lives in the South, Midwest, and Mountain States.
Thank you. Gene, let me bring you in here for a minute. You've written a little bit about the intersectionality of issues, which is another way to think about a map. It may not be geographic, but tell us about this, because I think it's another important frame into this conversation of who we're talking about and where we need to go next.
Yeah, I think the question of intersectionality will be a way to gauge how our community is maturing or not. We have tended to look at LGBT people just as LGBT people, as opposed to LGBT people who happen to be black or Hispanic or in poverty or undocumented workers, right? So I think as our community matures, we're going to start looking at the whole person. And often, for instance, we know that the rate of violence against transgender women, first of all, and particularly transgender women of color, there's a whole range of intersections there, right? It's about gender, it's about race, it's often about poverty, it's about all of those things together. And just looking at the sexuality piece doesn't allow you to look at the whole picture, which is the only way we're really going to help people.
When you get into race and gender and poverty, and you look more deeply into that, what are the things that ought to be top of mind for us?
Yeah, so I think we fail to understand the ways in which the sexuality question affects other parts of our lives. For instance, I think we have to look at the criminal justice system and policing. Now, we're going to hear a lot about that. It happens to be one of the few things that there seems to be bipartisan support for. But are we going to look at the rates at which LGBT people suffer at the hands of police and the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system in ways that far outpace the regular general population? We see 6 times the violence from police against transgender women than we do in the general population. We see a real, and Aisha has done lots of work on this, the school to prison pipeline, right? We have a prison industrial complex in this country that needs people, needs bodies, and they are particularly successful at getting black and brown bodies to feed that system. And we just have to see how those things are connected up, or else we won't solve any one of the pieces.
I thank you. Aisha, you live the map. I mean, every time I try and track you down, you're another part of the country because you're engaged with a political process. But I'd love to get your sense of the terrain. You know, Brad just helped us understand some of the big challenges and problems around the country, but you're out trying to get people elected. So how does the map look to you?
Well, so I think it's really appropriate that you titled this conversation Unfinished Business. Because when you look around the country and you look at all the states that Brad talked about where we have equality, it's not surprising that where LGBT people have the greatest gains, they're also the same states, the same jurisdictions where we also have political power, where we also have representation, where we have a significant number of out LGBT elected officials. When we look around this country at those states, he talked about the mountain region, he talked about the South. When you look at the states where LGBT people still don't have comprehensive non-discrimination, you're looking at states that, not surprisingly, have very few out LGBT people holding elective office. Moral of the story here, political power is the unfinished business for the LGBT community. Us being able to sit at the tables of decision-making is the unfinished business. You know, when I look at the when I look at the Supreme Court rulings, and you know, we're having a big celebration. I'm a marriage equality girl. I'm very gay married. I'm thrilled about this. But when we look just at what history has taught us about Supreme Court rulings or about legislation, we know that those aren't finished business, right? The Voting Rights Act can be gutted 50 years later by the Supreme Court. Ask women if they have gotten their right to choose and if they are fully liberated because the Supreme Court ruled. No. So the lesson for the LGBT community is that we have got to foster and develop a pipeline of leadership who are going to hold elected office in those 30-something states where we currently don't have full and equitable rights and full civil rights. And that is the work that we do at the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund and Institute, is we are the only organization that is fostering that pipeline of leadership and making sure that we have our place at the table and that we have a voice at the table.
Thank you. Brad, let me ask, I'm going to ask all three of you, and feel free to, let's turn this into a conversation. You know, one of the things that came up, we did a dinner last night, and it was very compelling. It was very diverse group, but one of the uncomfortable issues that came up, but I just want to put on the table is, you know, does the LGBT community really hang together? And I think it's one of the discussions that will come up, you know, items that will come up a bit today. I don't know if any of you remember in kind of global finance, there was a guy named Jim O'Brien at Goldman Sachs that came up with the term BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And at the time, people said there's really no reason to put them together. They were developing economies, but the dissimilarities were, greater than the similarities in some sense at that time. And so I'm just wondering whether, Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers last night said, there's a lot going on in the LG and B world, but the TQ and I world is being left behind. There are a lot of tensions we're not talking about. So again, thinking about a different way of the map, I mean, when you think about the agenda, are we making a mistake of talking about the community in a block? And what can we do about that? Brad, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I guess I would say as a movement and politically, I do think the LGBT are hanging together. And, who knew in the year that we would achieve marriage equality in all 50 states that we'd also kind of have this transgender moment, which is, really not an ending moment, but a beginning moment. But I think the way LGBT people around the country came together around the ordinance in Houston and felt the pain when it was voted down really shows that, really to me was heartening that people really are here for all of those issues. I think if there's any part of the LGBT that is left largely unconsidered still, it's bisexuals, and really looking at how, if you talk about vulnerability, whether in terms of poverty or health, a lot of the data points to bisexuals as the most vulnerable in our community, the least understood, and I think probably still the least talked about.
Aisha?
You know, the way that, yes, is the short answer. Yes. Something else that comes up, and I think about this, I remember what Brad was saying at the beginning about who constitutes our community in terms of, sure, the LGBT and IQ. Also, the racial aspect of the demographic makeup.
Right.
When we look at how power is amassed within the LGBT community, be it through elected officials in the political process, or who is leading the conversations around the campaigns, be it hero or otherwise, we aren't seeing a true reflection of the full rainbow of the community in the leadership and the voices necessarily, and the people sitting at the table. So for example, we know that in order to win in the South, and in order to win in some of these places where we still haven't, we have to start running and electing LGBT people of color and trans people, right? We have to be fully reflective of the communities that we're trying to develop leadership and foster leadership in, and we haven't done that well either.
What's the health of that pipeline?
The health of the pipeline is getting better. In fact, one of the things that Victory is doing is we have a very intentional program of what we call our empowerment fellows to create a pipeline of people of color and trans people that we are bringing in, recruiting, giving the skills and tools to be able to go off and to serve in the public sector. So we're being thoughtful about that in order to strengthen the health of that pipeline. But if you just look around the country right now, I could probably name 4 African American LGBT leaders, and maybe a dozen who are Latino, and that is telling given the demographic shift of our nation, and it's not reflected.
Jean, as you answer this question, I want you to tell us about your cool project, which, I don't hang out in churches like you do. So, but it sounds interesting. This theology of gender identity, and particularly with a trans element. But as you think about this broader association of compartments in the broad question of LGBT rights, should they hang together? What's your thought?
Yeah, I agree with Brad that bisexuality has not had the attention it's deserved. But I want to challenge us as a community. I think that we are including transgender people just because we have a T on the end of our acronym, when in fact, my experience is that gay and lesbian people are, by and large, as ignorant about transgender people and the lives they lead and the challenges they face as are straight people. And so I think this is a huge next piece of business for us. The religious community knows it lost on the marriage equality issue, and for the most part has lost on gay and lesbian issues. And so now they're turning their sights on transgender people. And we saw this in Houston with the HERO ordinance. And what changed that election was religious people coming forward and putting forward ads showing a dark and scary man following a young woman into a women's bathroom, right? Presumably heterosexuals masking themselves as transgender women so they can assault women in bathrooms. By the way, there is no record of that anywhere happening in America, but it's what changed that election. So we have to get serious about transgender people. I looked around in my work at the Center for American Progress. I looked around and saw that we had done the biblical and theological work around homosexuality, but for the most part, we have not done that work around gender identity. And so I convened a group of transgender people from around the country, rabbis, several ministers, and other people of faith. And what's coming out, and we'll roll this out in January with an event at CAP, is making the case for the full acceptance and participation of transgender people, both in the lives of religious institutions, but also in the culture. And it's sort of like, so if you're going to make the Christian or Jewish case, what scripture would you use? What Bible stories would you use? What theological statements would you use? And so I think we have to get really serious and about the transgender issue, and gay and lesbian people need to stop fooling themselves that they know very much about transgender people and the challenges. The one quick other thing I would say, I was shocked. 2 years ago, I was in Australia on a book and speaking tour. The intersex community in Australia is out, loud, vocal, in your face. You say LGBT without putting an I on, and people will come at you on the stage. I mean, it is astounding. And again, for the most part, I think our community would be hard-pressed to even define intersex. And so there's just lots of pieces of our community that need attention, and that we're going to have to convince ourselves that it's important.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Brad, I want to come back to you for just a minute. I want to ask everyone for short form, because I do want to go to the audience before our session ends. With marriage equality, there are two things that I'm wondering about. Is a lot of the marriage equality game was not achieved, according to some, through ground-up awareness raising. It may be, Harvey milk stamps and all the rest, right? It was won through courts. And the courts played an unbelievably important. If we were doing this right, we should probably have had some of the judges involved. We are going to have some of the plaintiffs from the court case, but courts mattered a great deal. And the other dimension of this is that after that, there is a view that many hold that many in the gay community or the lesbian community say, box checked. We can now ease up. We can go worry about other things. And I'm wondering whether when we think about unfinished business, the other pockets of the equation that need attention, homeless children, violence, trans questions, whether or not there's enough energy in the community, because I see a lot of apathy after the win. Aisha and then Brad.
Yeah, so we won through the courts, but I think it's really critical for us all to remember that there has to be an army of influence of folks who are defending defending the ruling and making sure that we don't see any setbacks in the states. Immediately what followed is that the religious, right, folks who are resting on the Bible as their defense, came after LGBT people and tried to repeal the court ruling through the legislative process. So it's really, really critical that we are reminded about that, and that a court ruling isn't everything, and that we have to have our people who are in those legislatures, who are sitting in the city councils, who can make sure that we don't suffer any setbacks.
Thank you. Brad?
Yeah, I don't think it just went through the courts. I think the LGBT movement really learned from other movements, and you saw several decades of work focused on courts, focused on legislatures, and really focusing on talking to other Americans and changing minds and people evolving upon their opinions by marriage. So when that case landed before the Supreme Court, there was actually majority public support for marriage equality in this country, and that took a whole lot of different strategies. And so I think we learned a lot from other movements, and we're going to have a multi-pronged approach as we move forward on other issues. I guess I want to hammer home one point that we brought up several times, but that's going back to the unfinished business as we kind of think more about substantive lived equality from formal equality. And that is intersectionality. It's not a choice. It's not a soundbite. It's not a strategy. It's the reality of LGBT Americans' lives, and it's really the only way to move forward. We're really focused on youth right now and on poverty in the community. And if you look at poverty in the community, it's women and women of color with children who are most likely to be poor,
right.
Transgender people, people of
right.
color, and elderly people in general. To address their needs, we're going to have to address issues of gender discrimination, race discrimination, right. Needs of families with children. So it's really the only way to move forward to meet the needs of people in our community.
Thank you, Brad. Gene, quick answer?
Just quickly, I would remind us that the court battles aren't over. They've just changed their focus. So we've got religious liberty, so-called, and religious freedom being used as methods for an exception being made to following the anti-discrimination laws. That's where the religious right has turned, and we're going to see court case after court case until, again, we get up to the Supreme Court and get some kind of definition of where does religious liberty and freedom end, and how does that interface with our rights as individual citizens. And those court cases are going to go on for years, and we have to do it on both levels. It's not just the Kim Davises, and it's not just photographers and bakers not wanting to service gay weddings. It's deeper than that. It's what about the janitor in a church? The janitor who has no doctrinal or teaching duties at all. Why shouldn't that person be protected by anti-discrimination laws? Because the religion is the one that hires that person to do a non-religious job. I mean, that's the deeper gray area.
Gene, you wrote, I want to go to the audience really fast, but you wrote a powerful thing. You said this, speaking of these laws, such a law would presumably also protect members of the Westboro Baptist Church with its God hates fags approach, the crazy renegade Mormon man and his 25 wives, Satan worshipers and Scientologists. Almost anything passes for religion in this country, and there would be no end to the appeals for exemption following certain laws based on the tenets of one's religion, no matter how small and no matter how outside the mainstream that religion. If I could get it to 140 characters, it'd be a cool tweet. But so with that, let me go to the audience real quick. We're trying to stay on time today. John?
Hi, I'm John Craig. I live over in Arlington, and I've conducted nationwide conferences for bisexual men around the country. And I've noticed that some of them actually are prominent leaders in their communities, and yet they're quite closeted and invisible still.
So we have 1 minute and 3 seconds, my friend.
So, Brad, I'd like to ask you, out in Los Angeles, you mentioned bisexuality as being an underserved population, and I was wondering, at what point did the Williams Institute begin to have that realization that this was an issue?
Brad?
Yeah, I think for years we've noticed that across studies where we have the data to break out bisexuals from lesbians and gay men in the data, that whether you're looking at income, whether health, violence, domestic violence, the rates for people who are bisexual are much higher. And so, when we say LGBT people are more likely or as likely to be poor as non-LGBT people, if you take the bisexuals out of that equation, those differences really start to diminish or disappear. So this, I think, like understanding the needs and addressing the needs of transgender people, is a place where we're so hampered by not having data. And so one big push we need at the federal level, state level, and in private surveys is to add those sexual orientation and gender identity questions that allow us to identify every part of our community.
Thank you. We're out of time, but Aisha, I want you to, if we were to take one thing home today that you thought was important, and Gene as well, that we need to think about in this unfinished business, what is the one thing you want the audience to know?
Marriage equality was a milestone, not the destination towards equality, and that we need to now focus on amassing political power to ensure that we maintain the gains that we've achieved.
Gene?
If indeed we are going to be a mature community, we have to care about all of our community, and that includes transgender people, it includes bisexual people, intersex people, and we need to educate ourselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brad Sears from UCLA, Aisha Moodie-Mills from Victory Fund, and Gene Robinson from the Center for American Progress, thank you very, very much.